Publishing applications. Before you can use an application on a Citrix Metaframe XP server, the application must first be made available by publishing it. In the Citrix Management Console, we'll come up here and we'll right-click on Applications, and here you can see we do have quite a few options. First of all, we can refresh the list of applications, and we can perform the same task by pressing F5 on the keyboard. We can also create a new folder, which just places a new folder underneath the Applications folder over here, which just makes organising our applications easier. So for example, you might publish a few applications that are only used by a specific department. So that way you could have, say, a marketing folder here, and then for example, place all of your applications that only the marketing department uses inside this folder. Now next we can search for a specific application that's assigned to specific users. Then we can publish an application as well as create a new resource manager application. So we'll select Publish Application, and this starts up the Publish Application wizard. So the first thing we need to provide is a name for our application and a description. Now this is only a display name, not the actual parts of the application, so you can call it whatever you like. So we'll publish the Windows Calculator in this example, so we'll type in Windows Calculator, and then we'll make our application description the same. So we'll come down here and we'll click on Next. And now we can specify what we want to publish, so whether it's going to be an application, a desktop, or some content that we wish to publish. Now an application is kind of self-explanatory, but if we choose desktop, this would allow us to publish the desktop of a specific Metaframe XP server, including all of its programs, its start menu items, and so on. And content allows us to publish a URL, say to an intranet server or a file on a server, and so on. So we'll choose application, as it's the Windows Calculator that we're going to publish, and then we'll need to provide the command line path to the Windows Calculator executable file. So we'll go over here and we'll click on Browse, and then we can select our server from the box here, and we know that the Windows Calculator is located on our C drive under Windows, and we'll scroll down and we'll double click on System 32, and then we'll just locate the Calculator executable, which is here, and we'll click on OK. So we can see the command line now has been populated for us, and the working directory has been put in as Windows System 32, which is of course where calc.exe lives, so we'll click on Next. Now we have to configure the program neighbourhood settings. Now up here we can actually create a new folder by simply typing in the name, and we'll just call ours Apps. But of course, if we already had a folder with applications in it, we could simply type in the name of that folder here, and our Windows Calculator application would then be added to that folder. Now next we can specify if we want shortcuts to the application to be added to the client's start menu. If we select this option, then we can also direct the shortcut to be placed within a specific folder, then by typing in the name here. Now we can also add a shortcut to the client's desktop if we wish. And finally down here we can change the icon associated with the application if we want, but we'll just leave these defaults and we'll click on Next. Now we can set the application session window size and colours, and whether we want the application to start without the title bar or to have the application start maximised. Now these options are kind of pointless as the calculator is fixed in size, but if you were publishing something like Microsoft Word, which of course can be resized, then starting the application maximised might actually be a good idea. So we'll leave these and we'll just choose Next. And now we can choose to enable audio, which is the default. Now Calculator of course doesn't provide audio feedback, but we'll just leave this default setting for now. We can also set the level of encryption we want to provide when we use this application. Now the default is basic, and we will leave that, but if your application happens to be of a more sensitive nature than the Windows Calculator, you could choose all the way up to 128-bit. Now at the bottom we also have the option of starting the application regardless of whether any printers have been created. Now we'll just leave these defaults and we'll choose Next. Okay, so how many instances of the Windows Calculator are we going to allow users to run? We could limit the entire farm to a certain amount of instances of a calculator running at the same time. Now it's unlikely we'd want to do this, but where it's very useful is in keeping with licensing requirements. So for example, if you have 100 licenses to run Microsoft Word, you might limit the entire farm to around 100 copies of Word simultaneously. Now we can also limit each user to only running a single instance of Windows Calculator by checking this box. And finally, we can set CPU utilization for this application. Now the default is normal, but we can set it higher or lower depending on how much performance you need your server to dedicate to this application. Okay, well we need to tell the wizard from which servers are we going to allow users to run the Windows calculator. Well, we only have the one server, so it's an obvious choice for us, but if you have many servers, then you can have all of them provide the Windows calculator application or only a few, depending on your choice. So we'll just select our server 1 from the available servers container, and then we'll click add, and now it appears over here on the right on the configured servers list. So if we made a mistake, we could simply remove the server by highlighting it and then clicking on remove. But we want this one in here, so we'll go back and add it in, and then we'll choose next. Now we need to define which users are allowed to run our Windows calculator application. Now we can allow anonymous connections if we wish, although that's certainly not very secure doing that. Now if you already have a list of names that you want to allow access, now this list must be separated by semicolons, then you can click on this button here, provide the list details here, and then click on check names, and that will check those names against Active Directory users. So if we double click on our testdomain.com domain, we can then scroll down and select our users OU. Now here we can see the groups that we have in our domain. Now we can assign permissions to use our Windows calculator application to groups, and that's certainly best practice. But if we do want to add a specific user account, then we can click show users, and then we can scroll down and we can locate a user account that we wish to add. So in our instance, we'll just add the administrator account in, so we'll double click on that, or we can highlight and of course click add. If you do make any mistakes, you can select the configured account down here and of course select remove. But we've done that, so we'll click next. And now we can provide any file extensions that are used by our application. Now as there aren't any file associations for the Windows calculator, we can simply click on finish, and our application's now been published. And up here under applications, we can see the Windows calculator's been listed. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll drop down to our desktop, and if we double click on our Citrix program neighborhood icon, notice this is the first time we've used it. We do need to log in, so we'll log in using the administrator account, and we'll enter in a password. And of course, finally, the domain that we're logging in is, which is testdomain.com, and I'll choose to save this password so I don't have to enter these details in again, and then I'll click on OK. Okay, that's now authenticated us, and up here we can see we do have another folder now called Apps. So we'll double click on that, and of course we can see here the Windows calculator. So I'll double click on the Windows calculator and we can see a connection dialog box appear. And now we can see it starts logging into the Windows 2003 server. And of course here's our calculator application now running. Now down in our taskbar we can see that the calculator is coming from a remote server, so that gives you some indication that it actually is coming from Citrix. Now if we close down this application, you'll be able to see that it logs off from the Windows server. Okay, so we'll close this down. Alright, well let's take a second look at publishing applications. This time we'll publish the desktop of our Metaframe XP server. So we'll right click on applications, and then again we'll select publish application, which starts up the publish application wizard. Okay, so the first thing we need to provide is a name and a description. So for ours we'll type in desktop, and we'll give the same description of desktop, and then we'll click next. Now this time of course we're going to choose to publish a desktop, so we'll select the desktop radio button, and then of course we don't have actually any options down the bottom for specifying a command path because we are publishing a desktop and not an application, so we'll click on next. Now we have to configure our program neighborhood settings, and we'll use the same settings as we did earlier, so we'll put the icon in a folder called apps, and then we'll choose next. Now again we can set the application session window size and colors, and whether we want the application to start without the title bar or maximize the application at startup. Now we'll leave the default resolution of 640 by 480, but I'm going to bump the colors up to 24-bit color because 256 kind of looks a bit pointless and pathetic when we're dealing with a desktop. So we'll do that, we'll click on next, and again I'll leave the default here to enable audio, and we'll leave the encryption level at basic, and I'll click next. Okay, so again we can limit the number of instances of this desktop we're going to allow our users to run. Now more than likely here we would limit the entire farm to a certain amount of instances, but again for our purposes, as this is just demonstration, we'll leave these defaults here and then we'll just click next. Now of course we need to add in our server. Now again we only have the one server here, so it's an obvious choice for us, but if you've got more than one server you can have all of them provide access to a desktop or only a few. It just depends on your choice. So we'll highlight our server 01, we'll click add to bring it over here to the configured servers, and then we'll click next. And now we can specify which users are going to be able to run our desktop. Now again, I would recommend that we don't allow anonymous connections to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and double click on my testdomain.com. I'll scroll down again and select my users OU. Over here I'll check the show users box, and then of course I'll scroll down, select my administrator account, choose add to bring it down here under the configured accounts list, and then we'll click on finish. And now we can see our desktop has been created. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump out to my desktop itself, and I'll double click on our Citrix program neighborhood, and then of course under our apps folder we need to hit refresh to see our new application. And of course here we can see our desktop. We already have our Windows calculator, so I'll double click on desktop, and now we can see that we're connecting to the desktop. The Citrix ICA client will try and contact the Metaframe server, and there we can see we are logging in. We are using pass-through authentication as we didn't have to enter in our username and password, so we're just running this under the context of our existing administrator account. And there you can see we have an identical desktop here which looks the same as the one behind it. You can see we've got the same icons. Now before I actually close out this desktop session, what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back to our Citrix management console. And then what we'll do is we'll come over here and we'll click on the desktop link. Now over here in the right hand pane under the users tab, we can quickly identify that the administrator account has logged onto this desktop session. We can see that they've logged onto server 1 from server 1. We can see the session number and we can see the session ID, and we can also see that the state of our connection is active and that the logon time occurred today. Now if we double click on this session here, we can see the processes that the administrator is currently using. Now if for some reason we do need to terminate a process, we could simply select the process, right click, and then select terminate. Now the session information tab shows us a bit more detailed information about this session, such as the client's IP address, the MAC address, the screen resolution, and so on. Now on the client modules, this tells us what modules the client's using, and of course the client cache simply displays some details about memory and disk cache being used. Okay, well this time we'll right click. Now firstly, we can connect to this session if this session somehow is disconnected. Of course we could disconnect the session. We could also send a message to the administrator, and in fact we'll do that now. We'll just send a test message here and we'll click on OK. Now we come back to our desktop client and we can see that we have a message here. So that can be a good way of quickly sending a message to the logged on user in case you need to perhaps log them off to perform some maintenance. You can just let them know that, hey, in 5 minutes if you haven't saved your work, I'm kicking you off the server. So we'll go back, we'll right click again. Now we can see we can also shadow the administrator's desktop. We could reset their session and we can check on the status of that session as well. Now of course the status just shows us some information about what type of network traffic has occurred on our particular session we're looking at the moment, and we'll right click back here again. We could also log off that session. We could check out the session information, which we did when we double clicked on the session, and of course here we can just sort and filter out this table of list if we do have multiple sessions going. Now we'll right click on our desktop this time, and you can see we've got a number of options. We can refresh the desktop, or we could also do the same thing by pressing the F5 key. We can also copy our published application. Now this is actually useful because it saves us from recreating the whole thing again if we want to create a second application with some minor changes. Now next we can actually create an ICA file. Now this is useful if you want to provide a link to a pre-configured application. You can then take this file, you could email it to your users or store it on a network file share for your users to then launch the application. So let's do that now. We'll create an ICA file, so we'll click on that and it opens up the ICA file wizard. And the first thing we get asked is, do we want any assistance with this? The default here of course is to explain every setting that comes along, or we can have minimal explanation required. Well, we'll go through and we'll leave the default to explain each setting, and we'll click next. So the first thing we'll do here is set the resolution of the desktop, and we've seen these options before. It defaults to 640 by 480, or we can use a relative percent of desktop size. So in other words, if we check this one here, the default is 75% of our existing screen size will be used for this desktop. Now we'll just use this absolute resolution of 640 by 480. We could also specify the number of colors, and we'll leave it at true color 24-bit, and we'll click next. Now we can select the encryption, and again we've seen this before, so we'll leave this at basic. Now we can specify whether we want the ICA data stream to be compressed or not. Now the default is yes, compress the stream, and we'll just leave that as it stands. Now we've got the sound quality. Now the default is low, and we'll leave that as we are running a server and really don't have a lot of need for sound, so we'll just click next. Now we can specify how can we contact our Metaframe server. If we leave the default settings here, we'll use UDP to locate the Metaframe server. But if we enable TCP plus HTTP browsing and then punch in the name of a Metaframe server, then the client will attempt to contact the Citrix XML service on port 80 to locate the server. So to use this, we could simply enter in server 01 for our server and then click next. Okay, so now we need to provide a path to save our ICA file we've just configured. So what I'm going to do is I'll just drop this on my desktop here. We'll just browse to our administrator account and desktop, and we'll just call this ICA, and we'll click on save, and that now puts the path here under the file name field, and then we'll choose next. Alright, well we're basically done now. At this point we can create an HTML file, but I'm going to leave the default here at no, and we'll come back and do that later. So I'll just click on next, we'll check the summary of everything that we've created here and configured, and then we'll choose finish. Now if I jump back out to my desktop, you can see I have an ICA file created here. Now what I'll do in the meantime is I'm just going to quickly log off this desktop session here. Okay, and now we'll come over to our ICA file and we'll double click, and we can see it's initializing. And now it pops up to our logon box for our Windows Server 2003. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to enter in the administrator account and the administrator password, and now you can see we're logging on again exactly the same way as we did before. The only difference is we're now logging on from a file. Alright, so I'll log this back off again. Now at this point, one thing I should actually make mention of is that the ICA file that we've just created is really only a text file. So if we right click, we'll select open with, and then we'll choose Notepad, and you can see all the parameters here for our ICA file. So you can change any of these settings if you wish, or alternatively you can go through the wizard and do it that way. So we'll just close this down. So we'll go back to our Citrix Management Console, and this time we'll right click, and now what we'll do is we'll create an HTML file, which is basically the same as the ICA file we created earlier. Now I really like this option, so what we're going to do is we're going to whiz through this wizard. Now here we have an option to create a new ICA file, which will basically run through the wizard that we just went through earlier, or we can use an existing one. Now I've already got the settings defined, so I'm going to use an existing one here, and then we'll choose next. So now we need to specify our ICA file name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on browse. We're already located at our desktop, so we can see our ICA.ICA file. We'll select that and choose OK, which obviously puts the file name here in the file name box. Then we'll click on next. And now we get to choose whether we're going to embed the desktop in the HTML file or have it launch in a separate window. I'm going to leave the default here for embedded, and then I'll choose next. Now I've got to specify which plugin we're going to use to launch the desktop process. We can either choose from a Netscape/ActiveX control or a Java client. Now I'm using obviously an Internet Explorer browser, and I'll choose the top one for the ActiveX control, and then I'll choose next. Now we can set the embedded window size. Now I'll leave the default, although it will actually have a few scroll bars for us because we are running this particular desktop window at 800 by 600, but that's fine. We'll leave that and we'll choose next. Now we're almost done. We can elect to have a lot of comments on the HTML page that will be created. Now this is the default, or we can uncheck this box and just have the desktop appear. Now I'll leave it as it is and we'll choose next. And now we get to specify where we want to have our HTML file saved to. So I'll click on browse again, and I'll go back and I'll drop this on my desktop, at our administrator account and our desktop, and again we'll just call this one ICA and choose save. We'll choose next. We can just review the summary, and if that looks okay, we'll choose finish. Okay, well I'll dump back out to my desktop again, and you can see I've got an HTML file here. So now if I double click on this HTML file, you can see that it's now starting to connect to my Metaframe server. So what I need to do now is punch in again my administrator account and my password. And now we can see it's logging on to our Metaframe XP server. So here we have our desktop running in Internet Explorer, and you can certainly see that we have full functionality as we normally would. Okay, so I'll just log this one off. And you can see it logs off, and we are presented still obviously with our open Internet Explorer page. And if we want to reconnect, we can simply click right here, and then it will start reconnecting back to our Metaframe server. I'll just select cancel. Now, a point to make here about this, you can see all this text and this sort of orangey bar down the left hand side. We have a lot of text over here as well. If you don't want to see any of that, we could uncheck that verbose option we saw when we ran through the HTML wizard. Okay, so there you can see published applications in action, accessible in a variety of ways. So as we've demonstrated, publishing applications, it's a very easy thing to do, although some planning is necessary to ensure that your applications are secure and available only to those users that require them.